January the 1st, 1901, Federation. Huge crowds gather throughout the 6 Australian colonies, bearing witness to the birth of their nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. The decades have been hard, arduous, but the nation is flourishing, growing rich on wheat, wool, and gold. Today, with the shackles of colonial rule shaken off forever, the future beckons. But beneath the champagne and laughter, there lurks a sense of unease, a deep and growing disquiet. Distant rumblings are being heard from the mighty empires of Europe. Nationalism, imperialism, greed and fear meshing ominously with the huge wheels of the Industrial Revolution, turning iron and steel into engines, cannon and warships in numbers never before thought possible. A great war is in the making. A British outpost, alone in the Pacific and surrounded by vast oceans over which sailed her very lifeblood, it was time for a fledgling nation to look to matters of defence, maritime defence, to build and train an Australian Navy. For though it could not be known to the celebrants of 1901, within little over a decade, their sons, fathers and brothers would be at the far side of the world, facing the horrors of the war to end all wars. Terra Australis Incognita, the fabled, immense, unknown land of the South. The subject of speculation since the time of the ancient Greeks, it would, along with the entire Pacific, remain shrouded in mystery until Magellan's epic circumnavigation of 1522. Though perishing in the attempt, the Portuguese admiral had, for European mariners, opened up a world of unimagined vastness. Over the next 200 years, European contact with Australia would be sporadic and ill-documented, the subject of widespread myth and conjecture. Buccaneers, privateers, names like Dampier, Tasman and de Torres would land at various points on the northern, western and even southern coastlines, generally more by accident than design. 1770, however, saw the matter definitively settled once and for all. On April 29, Lieutenant James Cook, commander of His Majesty's barque Endeavour, dropped anchor in Botany Bay, New South Wales. Subsequent months would be spent charting in detail a coastline still referred to by many as simply "place where there be dragons." The morning of August 22nd would see Cook and Endeavour lying off Cape York Peninsula. That evening at sunset, he would hoist his colours and claim the entire east coast of the Australian continent in the name of His Majesty King George III of England.
Very few historians acknowledge that one of the reasons the British settled Australia was to give it a maritime base that was astride both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Australia would give the British access to the sea lines of communication and a base from which they could mount operations against the Spanish who were in North America. So yes, Australia was a penal settlement, but it was just as important as a strategic sea base for the projection of Britain's maritime power and really to turn it into a worldwide empire.
Arthur Phillip and his wearied and wretched First Fleet dropped anchor in Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788. Australia Day. As if the putrid 8-month journey were not enough, calamity would beset the colony from the outset. The climate was harsh, the natives inhospitable, and the convicts were not farmers. Though its first 4 governors would all be naval officers, For New South Wales, maritime defence would remain little more than an afterthought, as the colony in its first decades struggled grimly for simple survival. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were ravaging nations on a scale never before seen. England, with almost 1 million men under arms, could little afford to think of her holdings in the Antipodes. Ultimately, though, the European conflict would yield a priceless dividend. English victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, all but securing the high seas for the next 100 years.
On the 21st of October 1805, a 100-year contest for command of the world ocean between Britain, France and Spain came to an end. The last hope of the French and Spanish was destroyed at Trafalgar. Nelson used brilliant, innovative tactics to completely demolish the French fleet. He didn't beat them, he annihilated them, and that was his object. It's no point fighting for its own sake. You've got to wipe these people out, otherwise they'll come back. After Trafalgar, the French and the Spanish are never coming out again. There is no challenge. Now the British can switch from the defensive and holding to the offensive, and they can begin to push power into the Indian Ocean. They're looking to open up whole new markets. So it's economic, and from economics flow trade, flow naval power, flow global power. The British know that every extra entrepot they've got around the world, that's more ships, more trade, more sailors, more tax, more money, more navy.
An awesome and unrivaled Royal Navy now sailed the oceans as it pleased. Under its protection, the empire on which the sun never sets would eventually hold sway over 1/4 of the Earth's lands and peoples.
The British government system is a relic of an administrative system put in place to raise a navy. I mean, that's what started the modern British governmental system. So, it's quite, fitting that for the British Empire, sea power is the source of its strength, because that's what the British government was set up to do, create and sustain sea power.
Its security guaranteed and safe from incursion, the colony of New South Wales was soon thriving. A hugely lucrative wool industry was in its ascendancy, and by the 1830s, Port Jackson had evolved into a significant commercial shipping hub and naval base. 1850 saw the national population climb to 405,000, separate colonies having been established in Van Diemen's Land, Swan River and South Australia. Yet despite maritime trade growing daily, the colonies still lacked any formal, permanent force of fighting ships, forced to rely instead on British warships on distant stations, a fact that sat uneasily with many colonials. Local concerns, though, would soon be overshadowed, for in 1851, Australia struck gold.
The gold rushes really put Australia on the map, and they put Australia on the map for the right reasons. Now Australia is seen not as a penal colony, not as a place to send convicts, but as a place where men and women can make their fortunes, a place where they can raise families. And I think that there are a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind. Victoria in particular is transformed almost overnight through the gold rushes. The population increases dramatically, and you have a city like Melbourne become one of the toasts of the world. It becomes one of the great world cities in only a few years. And Australians are very proud of that. It also encourages people to have a new relationship with the land. They become very interested in Australia as ours, our home, and this is something that's worth defending.
People poured in from all corners of the globe. Americans, Germans, Chinese, Italians, Poles, Hungarians, all accompanied by cultures and skills never before imagined in the Antipodes. And just as the rushes would transform commerce and industry, so too would they profoundly impact the national psyche. The distinctive ethos of camaraderie and mateship cast in the crucible of life on the diggings became integral to how many Australians saw themselves. Notions of equality, defiance, disdain of authority would become indelibly woven into the national character, from simple folklore to military narratives, from Ned Kelly at Glenrowan to the diggers at Anzac Cove. For Britain, what mattered was that a far-flung dominion was now not only producing significant amounts of wool and wheat, but over 40% of the world's gold supply. London soon decided the defence of such an asset to be in the imperial interest. British policy throughout the 19th century had been to protect strategic assets and trade routes via a series of localized naval commands or stations. At the time of the Crimean War in the mid-1850s, there existed major bases in the Mediterranean, the West Indies, and South Africa. While the Far East and Pacific was served by the East Indies Station at Bombay, the China Station at Hong Kong, and as of 1859, reflecting the Dominion's newfound status, the Australia Station at Sydney. On the 26th of March, Commodore-in-Command Captain William Loring hoisted a blue pennant in his new flagship, HMS Iris. Iris, a 26-gun, 900-ton frigate, was joined on the station by the 1,500-ton screw corvette Pelorus and the 3 sloops Nigeria, Cordelia, and Elk. Though significant developments all, popular opinion amongst the colonies still called for greater protection.
The problem is that the level of defence that the colonies see as appropriate to their perception of their needs and the way the British see it from Whitehall are completely different. In Australia, the mere appearance of a rather scruffy little Russian gunboat is enough to cause an invasion scare. In Whitehall, it's a laughable matter. The defence of Australia against the Russians is conducted in the Baltic. If the Russians ever thought of invading Australia, the British would have levelled St. Petersburg. You don't have to defend Australia in Australian waters. And that was a difficult lesson to teach to people with much more local view of their interests.
Compounding the problem was that by the mid-1860s, decades of downsizing now saw Queen Victoria's Royal Navy overworked and overstretched across the now vast British Empire. Furthermore, radical advances in warship design, largely due to the Industrial Revolution, were seeing timber and sail being replaced by iron and engine. Such was the pace of technology, warships were becoming obsolete almost as soon as they hit the water. It was a phenomenally expensive business. As a result, the 1865 Colonial Defence Act authorized the various colonies, at their own expense, to provide, maintain and use their own vessels of war. Volunteers would form part of the Royal Naval Reserve. Victoria enacted the new laws with enthusiasm, immediately ordering the radically new HMVS Cerberus, a 3,500-ton twin-screw armour-plated turret ship. The first British design to dispense entirely with sail power, its 4 18-ton, 10-inch muzzle-loading guns provided a firepower to match its menacing appearance. For training, the once mighty ship of the line Nelson was acquired. The first-class torpedo boat Childers and gunboat Albert completed what would become a formidable local force. South Australia, meanwhile, had acquired an excellent armoured cruiser in HMCS Protector, while Queensland maintained the gunboats Guyunda and Paluma. New South Wales, home of the Royal Navy's Australia Squadron, had less need of domestic forces. Garden Island, however, was duly designated as a naval depot, to be developed jointly by the Admiralty and the New South Wales government. The appointment of Rear Admiral George Tryon in 1884 raised the Australia Station to flag rank status and signified its growing importance to Britain. His flagship, the imposing 7,500-ton armoured cruiser HMS Nelson, would be the most powerful warship yet seen in Australian waters. The Australasian Naval Defence Act of 1887 saw the Admiralty agree to augment the Australia Station with an additional 5 cruisers and 2 torpedo gunboats for the express purpose of protecting floating trade in Australian waters. In return, the Australian colonies would contribute £106,000 sterling per year towards prime cost and maintenance. Katoomba, Mildura, Rigaruma, Tauranga, Wallaroo, Boomerang and Karrakatta arrived in Sydney on September 5, 1891, to great fanfare. Though technically an exclusively British force, many colonials would come to serve under Royal Navy command, and the squadron came to be seen by many as a stepping stone to an Australian navy of their own. June 1900, northern China. Chinese rebels, known as Boxers, aggrieved over increasing foreign influence in their nation's trade, politics and religion, rise up in brutal anti-European revolt, attacking churches and murdering foreigners throughout the Chinese countryside. By June, a force in excess of 20,000 had advanced on the cities of Tianjin and Peking, laying siege to the embassies of Britain, France, Belgium, the United States, Spain and Germany. England, already heavily committed to the Boer War in South Africa, sought help from the colonies as it went about raising an international coalition rescue effort. Despite 16,000 Australians already fighting for Great Britain in South Africa, the colonies would contribute a 500-strong joint force drawn from the New South Wales and Victorian naval brigades. Known as Blue Jackets, the contingent was accompanied by Her Majesty's colonial ship Protector and her crew of 110. To avoid legal complications, upon arrival, Protector flew the Royal Navy's White Ensign, and her officers received temporary imperial commissions. Following an horrific 2 months of atrocity and depravity, both Tianjin and Peking were captured, the uprising crushed, and Australian forces eventually withdrawn in April 1901. The men, however, would return home to a new nation, for on January the 1st, their collection of colonies had become the Commonwealth of Australia.
Australia cannot avoid her destiny as a sea power, and it is equally clear she must be dominant in this part of the world. To this end, she must have a navy. The laying of the foundations of a nation like ours must commence on a scheme of national defence for the wealth we are accumulating.
Under the new federal constitution, the various colonial navies and brigades were amalgamated into the Commonwealth naval forces. The ships themselves, however, were by this time mostly obsolete and inadequate even for training. Permanent personnel numbered only 240. Though under new legislation, Parliament did have the power to enact new defence laws, lack of funds meant there was little hope for new ships and personnel. Thus, to popular dismay, the Naval Agreement Acts of 1902-03 were signed, committing Australia to financially maintain the Royal Navy in the region for a further 10 years.
In this period of naval agreements where Britain negotiated with Australia and the other dominions and colonies to provide for their naval defence, what we do find is a suspicion, amongst Australians at least, that what they're paying for is not what they're getting. They're contributing to something that maybe they're not going to be the first and prime beneficiaries of. And this happens as the world changes. And people are naturally afraid. The world is changing in ways they don't like. Britain, after 100 years, is now being again threatened. So Australians increasingly took the view, we want to know that these ships we are paying for will stay in these waters and protect us. And increasingly with time, that was something the Royal Navy couldn't promise.
For much of the 19th century, the twin effects of the Industrial Revolution and a dominant Royal Navy had provided Britons with a wealth, power and status unrivaled since the days of ancient Rome. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, however, the playing field was being sharply levelled. Germany, France, America, Japan and others had all industrialised rapidly. Each with their own strategic and economic agendas, they all nevertheless desired a common goal, an end to British hegemony. Pursuit of empire was seen as preeminent in securing both strategic assets and vital raw materials, which in turn could feed the furnace of industry. In less than 4 decades, the European nations alone would add over 23 million square kilometres to their existing colonial portfolios. The major targets, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Germany had unified in 1871 and was rapidly proving an industrial and military juggernaut. By the turn of the century, not only did she possess the world's most powerful army, plans were well underway for a seagoing fleet based around no fewer than 38 battleships. Furthermore, her population was growing exponentially, nationalism was rampant, and foremost in the state consciousness were the concepts of Weltpolitik and Lebensraum, policies that sought Germany's place in the sun astride the world's mightiest empire. Her colonial possessions in the Pacific included German New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Caroline Islands, Marshall Islands, and Western Samoa. All of this was backed up by the German East Asiatic Cruiser Squadron, based at Tsingtao, China. In 1906, its flagship, the armoured cruiser Fürst Bismarck, boasted 4 9-inch and 12 6-inch guns, with 8-inch armour-plated belt and turrets. Nothing on the Australia station could match her for speed, firepower and endurance. Of all this, the eminent British strategist Sir John Colham had concluded,
"If we refuse to be warned, in time a great war will probably strew the Pacific Ocean with examples of British ineptitude. There is nothing more remarkable than the development of German war power in her territories abroad. She sees in maritime force the solution to the difficulties which confront us on distant naval stations."
Back in Australia, meanwhile, Captain William Creswell had been appointed Director of Naval Forces. Having inherited a service described in his own words as on the brink of collapse, his voice was foremost among the agents for change, an Australian Navy manned by Australian sailors. His proposal, however, that would furnish the Commonwealth with the nucleus of such a fleet was soundly rejected by the Admiralty, described as a misapplication of maritime power opposed to every sound principle of maritime strategy. And then there was the spectre of the world's newest superpower, Imperial Japan, and a navy which in a mere 15 years had evolved from a maritime nonentity into a modern battle fleet of 250,000 tons, including 6 new battleships. As to how well it could fight, the answer would be revealed on the terrifying afternoon of May 27, 1905, in the Tsushima Straits between Korea and Japan. In one of the most shocking and decisive naval battles of all time, the entire Russian Baltic fleet would be annihilated within a mere 6 hours. Admiral Heihachiro Togo utilizing his fleet's superior speed and modern artillery to devastating effect.
These were particularly ugly, unfamiliar, hellish deaths, the first of modern age. Our sailors were terrified by what looked like liquid fire leaping on the sides of the ship, as if the steel itself was on fire. Battleships of 900 men were sunk in minutes. Any survivors churned up in the massive engines.
An ominous new era of naval warfare had begun. At day's end, over 5,000 Russian sailors were dead, and of the 45-ship-strong Baltic fleet, only 2 destroyers and a single light cruiser were spared to limp north to Vladivostok. The significance of the victory was not lost on Australia, Britain, Germany, or America, and prompted US President Theodore Roosevelt to comment,
"In a dozen years, the English, Americans, and Germans, who now dread each other as rivals in the Pacific, will each have to dread the Japanese more than they do any other nation. If we fail to keep our Navy at the highest point of efficiency and size, then we shall invite disaster."
The fact that since 1902 Great Britain had actually been allied with Imperial Japan only amplified Australian concerns, as did Whitehall's decision following Tsushima to recall its 5 China Station battleships back to European waters.
Certainly, I think at the end of empire, sitting where Australia does, you get this sense of kind of detachment, and it's really easy to feel like you're at the end of a system, or you can be forgotten, or you're not appreciated, and it creates this kind of question of perceptions. What signal is the British Empire sending out about its desire to protect? What will it protect? So, did Australia come out as kind of the second-class citizen? Probably, yeah, it did. It's realpolitik. But from an Australian perspective, to be left to be guarded by the Japanese, that's a whole different ballgame than what they were signing up to before about federation and empire and all this kind of stuff. And it creates some real uneasy feelings about just exactly what the security of Australia is in the pecking order of imperial defense. Where does it rank?
Australian fears concerning Asia were nothing new. Since the time of the gold rush and the huge influx of Chinese migrant workers, European Australians remained deeply suspicious of Asiatic cultures and peoples in general. Such xenophobia saw the Immigration Restriction Act, later to become known as the infamous White Australia policy, legislated as the first act of the new Australian Parliament and made for an anxious, even slightly hysterical young nation. As a leading periodical of the day prophesied,
Australians feel certain that their turn will come tomorrow. They are nervously apprehensive of something sweeping down upon them from the sullen saffron north. They know their peril.
Popular sentiment demanded action, and on Christmas Day 1907, Prime Minister Alfred Deakin made an independent approach to the United States, inviting President Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet to Australia. Consisting of 16 new battleships manned by 14,000 sailors and painted entirely in white, the Armada represented an awesome concentration of naval firepower, an American statement to the world. About to embark on its maiden deployment, a 14-month, 43,000-mile circumnavigation of the globe, the fleet was due to visit ports in the Caribbean, South America, Asia, and the Middle East. And now, Australia. 8 months later, crowds of over 500,000, larger even than those of Federation itself, lined Sydney Harbour to welcome the ships and men. Australians were ecstatic, and the next 8 days passed in a blur of non-stop celebration and festivities. A visiting American journalist writes of
Fleetitis, raging all over the Antipodes just now. All Australia is jumping mad in delight, and on every corner there seems to be a band playing the Star-Spangled Banner.
The mood of the British Admiralty, however, was decidedly cool, and in fact, the then Parliamentary Undersecretary, one Winston S. Churchill, openly opposed the visit. Australians, however, would have none of it. Britain, they felt, had ignored their defence requirements for years, but now a powerful ally in the Pacific had embraced them. Furthermore, it was an ally who shared their values, culture, and importantly for the time, Anglo-Saxon heritage. As the Melbourne Herald proclaimed,
It is impossible to overrate the significance of the new Entente Cordiale, pregnant with the greatest and most momentous possibilities between two peoples who stand in the Pacific for the dominance of the white race.
Though far from impressed by what it considered American showboating in the Pacific, Britain's overriding strategic focus was now, of necessity, trained firmly on Europe, and in particular, the ominous, escalating, and hugely expensive naval arms race with Imperial Germany. Since 1889, British maritime doctrine had enshrined the famous two-power standard, meaning that at all times the Royal Navy would maintain a numerical strength equivalent to the combined naval forces of its two closest rivals. By 1909, however, with the rise of the great industrial nations, who all now understood the stupendous strategic value of sea power, the Royal Navy was being sharply brought back to the field. Ironically, Britain herself would contribute in one very specific way to her own demise. The year was 1905, and the occasion was the launch of the most revolutionary, most influential, and most terrifying warship ever imagined.
The launch of HMS Dreadnought effectively marked a sort of new datum point for measuring the strengths of navies. At 17,900 tons, 10 12-inch guns, top speed of about 21 knots, driven by steam turbines. And this was a warship which, at a stroke, made every other warship in the world obsolescent.
Not only was she the fastest ship afloat, she was also the most powerful. The Battle of Tsushima had proved the value of large caliber artillery, hence Dreadnought's unprecedented main battery of 5 twin turrets, each mounting a pair of colossal 12-inch guns, providing over twice the firepower of conventional battleships of the day.
And it was utterly impressive. Everybody just stopped. There was a kind of double take around the world. And some countries said, okay, we can't afford that. That's the end of it. Germany was one of the countries that said, we want some of those. And Britain now had a lead of 1 instead of a lead of 30.
The first great arms race of the 20th century had begun. Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, and of course the Kaiser himself, now all craved desperately their own versions of this extraordinary English ship. In fact, such was the design's impact that thereafter all battleships would be known as either dreadnoughts or pre-dreadnoughts.
Dreadnought is not a warship, it's a deterrent system. As soon as Dreadnought is finished, you've got a whole new measure of power. They don't call them battleships, they call them dreadnoughts. That's how successful Dreadnought is. It changes the language of international politics. How many dreadnoughts have you got?
Over the coming years, German dreadnought production would be prodigious. Relations with England reached new lows. As far as Britons and Australians were concerned, the German Navy was being created for one purpose: to realize grand imperial ambitions and wrest command of the seas from Great Britain. Should the unthinkable occur and the Royal Navy be defeated in Europe, Australia would be isolated and forced to surrender. Alarmingly, at the 1909 Imperial Conference in London, the Admiralty conceded for the first time in over a century that it could no longer guarantee British naval supremacy. The Australian government was advised that its country's future position might be one of some danger. Back in Australia, largely due to the efforts of William Creswell, naval affairs were already in the spotlight. And in fact, just months earlier, the federal government had, without consulting the Admiralty, placed orders for 3 700-ton oil-burning destroyers. In light of the European crisis, however, Great Britain's first Sea Lord, the legendary Admiral Jackie Fisher, now proposed a far more radical solution. In sum, that Australia should aim to create and fully man a self-contained fleet unit, comprising 1 battle cruiser, 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 3 submarines, plus auxiliaries, the entire force to be owned, controlled, and administered by Australia. Despite the sheer scale of the idea, not to mention the phenomenal cost, the proposal was accepted and construction began immediately. An offer of British financial assistance would be politely but proudly refused. These would be Australia's ships. On July 10, 1911, King George V granted the Commonwealth Naval Forces the title of Royal Australian Navy. Henceforth, all Australian warships would be designated HMAS, His Majesty's Australian Ships.
The acquisition of HMAS Australia was a momentous event for this country. Here was a ship that was the most powerful in the Southern Hemisphere. Here was a ship that allowed Australians to say, we are a nation, we can stride the world stage. We are a naval power, albeit small, but we have a ship that can mix it with the best of them. And it was a source of enormous pride that we, Australia, would have a dreadnought.
HMAS Australia was an indefatigable class battlecruiser, an evolution of dreadnought that sacrificed the battleship's heavy armour plate while retaining its monstrous firepower. The result? A 19,000-ton warship capable of both 25 knots and 12-inch broadsides.
High-speed version of the Dreadnought, which is absolutely perfect for vast open ocean operations. And what we see in 1909 is Australia going from a concept of let's hunker down and defend ourselves to one of let's join in the imperial concept. So you're seeing Australia taking a much more positive, confident view of itself. Australia is now a player in the imperial system. Big, powerful fleet, don't mess with us, we can do bad things to you. There are countries in the world that don't have dreadnoughts, big countries. And Australia is up there with the top 10. It's a great place to be.
With the new Navy now awaiting its new ships, what was needed more than anything was men to sail them. Even by December 1911, RAN personnel strength stood at only 400. The new ships alone would require 10 times that number. Williamstown, Victoria was designated an interim facility for recruit training. Required for normal entry were smart, active youths and young men between the ages of 17 and 25 and of very good character. Soon, recruits were coming in so fast that the Navy was forced to raise the age of entry. Meanwhile, under the Boy Seaman Entry Scheme, an old three-masted clipper, Sabroan, was purchased and converted to a training ship. In April 1912, she commissioned as HMAS Tingara and accepted the first entry of 37 boys, all between 14 and 16 years of age. Though little more than children, stringent, harsh discipline and constant rigorous training would characterize their lives, yet prove invaluable. Within 2 years, many would experience combat at sea aboard HMAS Sydney under German fire in the Indian Ocean. By mid-1913, personnel strength reached 2,500, supplemented by a loan of 900 sailors from the Royal Navy. And it was now that Great Britain's preeminent naval doctrine came to the fore.
The active and willing support of the Royal Navy was critical to the success of the fleet unit concept. It was a pretty audacious exercise to expect an ocean-going Navy to be created from scratch virtually overnight. No nation, and certainly no Dominion, had attempted it before. And without the Royal Navy's assistance in all manner of areas, it just wouldn't have happened.
The vital issue of officer training, however, proved contentious. Though it would certainly be convenient and relatively inexpensive to send officer cadets to Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, it was feared the process might create a product more English in bearing and attitude than Australian. The idea was discarded. The RAN would train its officers at home. On the 1st of March 1913, the Royal Australian Naval College opened at a temporary site at Osborne House in Geelong, Victoria. Among the initial intake were names destined for fame in later years: Getting, Farncombe, Felt, Long, Showers, and Collins. On the morning of October the 4th, 1913, HMAS Australia, flagship of the Royal Australian Navy, steamed out of the mist through Sydney Heads and into Port Jackson. With her were the cruisers Sydney, Melbourne and Encounter, and the destroyers Parramatta, Yarra and Warrego. Since dawn, huge crowds had gathered along the foreshore to witness the proudest moment in their nation's short history. Off Fort Denison, the Admiral's flag was struck aboard HMS Cambrian, signalling the end of British command of the Australia station, while aboard the battlecruiser flew the flag of Rear Admiral George Patey, commander of the Australian fleet and the largest, most powerful warship ever to sail in southern waters.
The sight of her revealed the nation's dreadnought in all her beauty and majesty. No longer a thing to be looked at on a printed page, but a living, sentient thing whose mission is to guard our shores.
The day would end with many impassioned and patriotic speeches, proclaiming responsibilities of nationhood and coming of age. For what the nation had taken possession of was far more than steel, rivets and cannon. It was a tangible, awesome symbol of national sovereignty. A sovereignty soon to be tested, for in little over 6 months, Australia would be at war.